Don't take advantage, don't stick it in. The rancher did, and fury followed. Caleb Turner had always been seen as a steady man. People in the small cattle town trusted him because he rarely rushed into decisions and almost never raised his voice. He had grown up around ranch life, learning from his father that land, animals, and people all needed patience. Nothing good, his father used to say, came from forcing things too quickly. For years, Caleb followed that advice, and it helped him build a modest but respected ranch on the edge of town. His days usually began before sunrise. He would check fences, feed the horses, and walk through the grazing fields while the air was still cool. Those quiet mornings gave him time to think. Life was simple, sometimes hard, but it made sense. The land gave back what you put into it, and people generally respected honest effort. Things started to change the day he attended the livestock auction in the neighboring county. Auctions were more than business events. They were social gatherings where ranchers exchanged news, opinions, and sometimes warnings. That day, after most of the cattle had been sold, Caleb stood near the fence talking with an older rancher named Walter Hayes. Walter had lived in the region for decades. His face showed years of sun and wind, and his voice carried the weight of experience. After a few minutes of casual talk, Walter leaned slightly closer and spoke in a lower tone.
He told Caleb about a piece of land not far from Caleb's ranch.
Bay. Two families were arguing over it. It wasn't a legal battle yet, but emotions were high. Bear. According to Walter, the families were still trying to sort things out peacefully. Then came the warning. Walter said Caleb should stay clear of the situation. He explained that stepping in too soon, especially for profit, could damage trust. His exact words were calm, but firm. He basically meant, don't take advantage of people when they are already struggling, and don't push yourself into a conflict that isn't yours. Walter wasn't accusing Caleb of anything. He was simply offering advice, born from years of watching how quickly small-town tensions could grow. Caleb nodded politely. At that moment, he truly believed he would stay out of it. But later that evening, curiosity started working on his mind. The land Walter mentioned bordered his own grazing fields. Owning it would make his ranch more secure. It would give him better access to water during dry months and space to expand his cattle numbers. From a business point of view, it made perfect sense. Over the next few days, he asked around quietly. Some people avoided the topic. Others said the dispute was messy but might end soon. A local agent hinted that one side could consider selling if the pressure continued. That piece of information planted a seed in Caleb's thoughts. He began telling himself he wouldn't be doing anything wrong. If the land became available legally, why shouldn't he buy it? After all, he had worked hard for years. Expanding his ranch wasn't greed, he reasoned. It was planning for the future. Still, a small voice inside him repeated Walter's warning.
Caleb tried to ignore that voice. He focused instead on numbers, maps, and practical benefits.
He walked along the boundary fence one evening, imagining how useful that extra space would be. The grass looked healthy, and a small stream ran along one edge. During dry seasons, that stream could make a big difference for livestock. As days passed, he contacted the local agent again. This time, the conversation became more serious. One of the families seemed willing to talk about selling their share to avoid further stress. But the door was open. Hearing this made Caleb feel both excited and uneasy. He discussed the idea briefly with a close friend, Martin, who also ran a ranch nearby. Martin listened carefully, then reminded Caleb that community relationships mattered as much as land. He didn't tell Caleb what to do, but his cautious tone suggested that rushing could cause problems. Caleb appreciated the concern but felt confident he could handle things respectfully. Soon paperwork discussions began. Meetings were arranged quietly so they wouldn't attract unnecessary attention. Caleb told himself discretion, extraction, everyone involved. He wasn't sneaking around, he thought, just being professional. Yet every time he sat down with the agent, he remembered Walter's words. One afternoon, while reviewing early documents, he paused longer than usual before signing a preliminary agreement. It wasn't the final purchase, just a step showing serious intent. The pen felt heavier than usual in his hand. For a moment he considered stepping back, but then he pictured the benefits again. Stronger finances, better grazing control, long-term security. He signed. Afterward, relief mixed with tension. Part of him felt proud for taking initiative. Another part wondered whether he had just stepped into something more complicated than he expected. That evening, the sunset looked the same as always, but Caleb didn't feel his usual calm while watching it. News travels fast in rural areas, especially when land is involved. Within a week, people started hearing about Caleb's interest in the disputed property. No one confronted him directly at first, but he noticed subtle changes. Conversations at the feed store became shorter. A few neighbors who normally joked with him kept things strictly business. Bang.
Caleb tried to stay positive. He reminded himself nothing improper had happened.
Negotiations were legal, and he hadn't forced anyone. Still, he sensed growing discomfort around him. Even casual gatherings felt slightly tense. At home, he spent more time reviewing ranch finances, almost as if numbers could reassure him. Expansion had always been part of his long-term plan. Yet now the plan seemed connected to emotions he hadn't fully considered. One evening, while repairing a fence line, he spotted Walter Hayes riding over. Walter greeted him kindly but didn't waste time. He asked whether Caleb had gotten involved with that disputed land. Caleb answered honestly. Walter didn't scold him, but his disappointment was clear.
He simply said that sometimes being right on paper doesn't mean being right in the eyes of people who feel hurt. Those words stayed with Caleb long after Walter left.
Despite the tension, Caleb continued moving forward. Meetings progressed, though slowly. Legal details needed checking, boundaries required confirmation, and both families still had unresolved feelings. The process became more complicated than Caleb originally expected. During this period, sleep didn't come as easily. He found himself replaying conversations in his mind. Had he misunderstood the situation? Was he helping solve a problem or quietly making it worse? These questions didn't have simple answers. At the same time, pride pushed him onward. Backing out now would mean lost time, possible financial penalties, and perhaps appearing indecisive. Ranchers valued firmness. Caleb had always prided himself on being reliable, not hesitant. Weeks passed with this mix of progress and uncertainty. On the surface, everything remained professional. Underneath, emotions simmered, not only among the families involved, but also within the broader community. People cared deeply about fairness, tradition, and mutual support. Any action seen as opportunistic could leave marks that lasted years. Caleb began realizing that land deals in small towns were never just about land. They touched history, relationships, and shared memories. He had known this in theory, but was now experiencing it firsthand. Still, he kept telling himself things would settle once negotiations finished. Results, he believed, would speak louder than worries. If the deal ultimately benefited everyone, perhaps tensions would fade. Yet even as he tried to stay optimistic, that quiet, uneasy feeling never fully disappeared. Each time he passed the disputed fields, he admired their potential but also sensed the invisible weight attached to them. Opportunity and risk walked side by side, and he wasn't sure which would win. By the end of that month, Caleb stood at a crossroads. The deal wasn't final yet, but momentum carried it forward. He could continue toward expansion and hope. Relationships adjusted over time, or he could pause and reconsider the human side of the situation more deeply. Watching his cattle graze one evening, he realized something important. Success in ranching wasn't only about acres or profits. It was also about trust, the unspoken agreements neighbors relied on during droughts, emergencies, and hard seasons. Losing that trust could cost more than any land purchase could ever gain. Still, decisions once started often developed their own pace. Caleb had stepped forward, and turning back now would require courage of a different kind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt both hopeful and uneasy, aware that whatever happened next would shape not just his ranch, but his standing in the community he had always called home. The days after Caleb signed the preliminary papers for the disputed land began differently than he expected. Normally, his mornings were calm and predictable, filled with the familiar rhythm of feeding animals, checking fences, and walking through his fields. But now, there was tension in the air. He noticed that conversation in town had a sharper edge, even when no one mentioned the land directly. At the feed store, where Caleb usually chatted with neighbors about cattle, hay, and equipment, people were polite but distant. The small jokes and shared laughter he was used to had almost disappeared. Instead, the conversations were short, practical, and careful. He could feel the change, even in small interactions like picking up a bag of feed or buying nails for repairs. Caleb realized that people were observing him, and their eyes carried questions, doubts, and perhaps even disappointment.
At first, he tried to ignore it.
After all, nothing he was doing was illegal. The land was available for purchase, and he had acted professionally. But the more he tried to focus on his routine, the more he felt the undercurrent of disapproval. Even his longtime friends began to offer subtle warnings. One afternoon, Martin, his neighbor and closest friend, came by while Caleb was fixing a gate. Martin leaned against the fence and said, "Caleb, I know you mean well, but people are talking."
They think you're stepping in where you shouldn't.
Caleb sighed.
I'm not forcing anyone, Martin. I'm just trying to secure my ranch. It's business, nothing else. Martin shook his head slowly.
I get that, but sometimes in a small town, business isn't just numbers.
It's relationships. And relationships, they matter more than any land deed. Caleb appreciated the advice, but he also felt frustration building. He had always believed in fairness and doing things the right way. Yet now it seemed that even his careful steps were being judged. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had underestimated how emotionally tied the families were to the land. It wasn't just property. It was memory, tradition, and pride. The following week, the first real signs of community tension became apparent. At a local town meeting, a few neighbors quietly mentioned the dispute. Their words weren't hostile, but their tone carried subtle judgment. Caleb listened as they discussed past disagreements, how family ties and history made the land sensitive, and how any outsider, even someone like him, well-respected and trustworthy, might be seen as taking advantage. Caleb tried to respond calmly. He explained that his interest was straightforward. He wanted to expand his ranch in a way that was legal and fair.
But some people seemed unconvinced. Their concerns weren't personal attacks. They were reflections of the community's values.
In their eyes, stepping into a delicate situation, no matter how professionally, could be seen as opportunistic. Back at home, Caleb began thinking more deeply about the balance between opportunity and community respect. Each morning while checking fences and feeding the cattle, he replayed conversations in his head. He considered whether the land was truly worth the growing tension. Base. He also reflected on Walter Hayes's words from weeks ago. The older rancher had warned him not to take advantage of the situation. Now Caleb began to understand the weight behind that advice. It wasn't just about legality or profit, it was about trust, reputation, and long-term relationships. Despite the growing unease, Caleb kept moving forward. The agent handling the land deal continued sending updates. He learned that the families were still negotiating internally, but one side seemed more willing to sell under pressure.
Caleb wondered if his interest was influencing their decisions. That thought unsettled him.
He had never intended to push anyone into a choice. They were grown adults, capable of deciding for themselves. Still, the possibility lingered that his involvement had changed the dynamics of the situation. One afternoon he rode his horse toward the disputed land, curious to see it up close. Pay. As he crossed the boundary line, he noticed signs of recent use. Footprints, old fences, and evidence of grazing. It was good land, fertile and strong. Bet. Caleb imagined his cattle grazing there during summer, the stream flowing gently across the fields. Yet alongside that vision came a feeling of unease. He realized that while he could see practical benefits, he couldn't see the emotional weight that others attached to the land.
In town, rumors began to spread.
Bex. Small comments made in passing grew into conversations among groups of ranchers and families. Some sympathized with Caleb, saying he was simply making a smart business move. But others whispered that he had acted too quickly, that he hadn't considered the feelings of those involved. Caleb tried to dismiss the rumors, focusing on work, but he couldn't ignore the way people began to treat him differently. Invitations to casual gatherings became rare, and neighbors who once helped freely with repairs or equipment now declined politely. The growing distance affected him more than he expected. For the first time in years, Caleb felt isolated in his own community. He had always believed that working hard and acting fairly would earn respect. Now, he realized that respect could be fragile, influenced by perception as much as by deeds. One evening, while sitting on his porch watching the sun set over the fields, Caleb thought about his father's lessons. Nothing good comes from forcing things too quickly, his father used to say. Caleb wondered if he had moved too fast, even with the best intentions. He reflected on the balance between ambition and patience, understanding that every action had consequences that might not be immediately visible. He decided to reach out quietly to one of the families, not to negotiate land, but to listen and understand their perspective. The conversation was difficult at first. They were polite but guarded, their words cautious. Caleb realized they feared losing more than property. They feared betrayal, misunderstanding, and having their trust taken for granted. Listening to them, he began to see the situation through their eyes.
His involvement, no matter how legal or reasonable, had created stress and tension. Caleb left the conversation with mixed feelings.
He still hoped the deal could work out fairly, but he recognized that he had entered a delicate situation that required more care, more patience, and more understanding than he had originally thought. That evening he shared his thoughts with Martin, explaining how complicated things had become. Martin nodded thoughtfully, saying, "Sometimes it's not the land or the money, it's the way people feel about it. That matters more than anything else." As the days turned into weeks, Caleb began noticing small acts of resistance from neighbors. A fence that normally would have been repaired quickly remained broken longer than usual.
Equipment that used to be shared was no longer available. Invitations to help with community events dwindled.
Personally. But he understood the message. Trust takes time to build and can be lost quickly. At the same time, he tried to maintain his daily routine. He focused on feeding and caring for his animals, repairing fences, and keeping his ranch running smoothly. The land deal was important, but he learned that community relationships were just as critical. A rancher might own acres of land, but without neighbors who were willing to cooperate, even the best property could feel empty and isolating. One morning, Caleb rode past the disputed land and noticed children playing near the fences. Their laughter reminded him of his own childhood and the sense of community he had once taken for granted.
He realized that the land wasn't just soil and water. It was part of people's lives, history, and memories.
This understanding brought a new layer of responsibility. He wasn't just buying land. He was stepping into lives that had already been built around it. By now, the initial excitement he had felt about expanding his ranch had faded. In its place was a careful, thoughtful approach. He began to consider the human side of every decision, realizing that practical benefits alone were not enough.
He started keeping notes, planning how to communicate openly with both families and neighbors, and thinking about ways to demonstrate fairness and respect.
Despite the difficulties, Caleb refused to give up entirely. He believed that problems could be solved through patience, honesty, and understanding. He spent hours reflecting on possible solutions that could benefit everyone without causing unnecessary conflict.
He also reminded himself that mistakes were opportunities to learn.
While he wished he had approached things differently from the start, he was determined to handle the situation as responsibly as possible moving forward. Best. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Caleb walked through his fields, thinking about the balance between opportunity and responsibility. He realized that even in ranch life, where work is often straightforward, human emotions add layers of complexity. The land deal had become more than a business decision. It was a test of character, patience, and understanding. Caleb also began to notice subtle signs of change within himself. He became more attentive to listening rather than speaking first. He asked questions before offering solutions. Best. He started to see people not just as neighbors or competitors, but as individuals with history, feelings, and perspectives. That shift in thinking didn't make the land deal easier, but it gave him a clearer sense of purpose, to move forward carefully, respectfully, and thoughtfully. By the end of the second month, Caleb had learned that patience and humility were just as important as planning and ambition. While the community still watched him closely, he began building small bridges of trust. A neighbor stopped by to borrow a tool, and Caleb made a point to offer help willingly. A family member from one of the disputed properties accepted his invitation to discuss concerns over coffee. These small steps signaled the beginning of healing, even as tensions remained. Caleb understood that resolving the situation would take time. There were no quick fixes, and no single action could erase misunderstandings. But he felt confident that by acting with honesty, integrity, and respect, he could eventually find a balance that worked for everyone. Even though the land deal was still uncertain, Caleb began seeing progress in subtle ways. Neighbors nodded as he passed. Conversations grew slightly warmer. And, most importantly, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility, not just for his ranch, but for the trust and relationships that formed the foundation of his community. By learning to slow down, listen, and consider others' perspectives, Caleb discovered an important truth. Success is not only measured by what you achieve, but by how you achieve it and who you bring along with you. It was a lesson he would carry forward for the rest of his life, shaping not only the future of his ranch, but the way he lived in harmony with the people around him. The tension that Caleb had felt for weeks now began to show in more obvious ways. But what had once been quiet whispers and subtle distance from neighbors now became noticeable gestures and pointed conversations in town.
Even the local town council meetings, which had always been calm and orderly, now carried a tense energy that made Caleb uneasy.
He had expected challenges when dealing with land, but he hadn't realized how deeply emotions could run in a close-knit community. The families involved in the dispute became more vocal about their feelings. During one council meeting, voices that were normally calm rose with emotion. People expressed frustration over perceived unfairness, worry over traditions being disrupted, and anxiety about neighbors taking advantage. But Caleb listened quietly, feeling the weight of the room's energy. He knew that no words he spoke could immediately change what they felt. He had always believed that being honest and fair was enough. But now Caleb realized that perception mattered as much as intention. In small towns, a single misstep could grow into a story that overshadowed facts. Some people whispered behind his back, wondering if he had acted too quickly. Others openly questioned whether he had tried to manipulate the situation. Caleb understood why they felt that way, even though he knew in his heart that he had not done anything wrong intentionally. Despite the tension, Caleb continued to work on his ranch every day. He tended to the cattle, repaired fences, and maintained the land with the care he always had. Yet, even in these familiar tasks, the absence of his neighbor's help was felt strongly. Work that had once been simple now took longer because he could no longer rely on the casual assistance that had been part of small-town life. Equipment loans were refused, advice was given sparingly, and even small favors were met with hesitation. Caleb began noticing other signs of tension too. Invitations to community events disappeared, casual greetings were shorter, and even old friends avoided discussing the land. These small actions were not overtly hostile, but they carried a quiet judgment. Dispatch. Caleb understood that trust, once shaken, could take months or even years to rebuild. He also realized that his decision, though legal and practical, had caused ripple effects far beyond the paperwork. One day, Martin stopped by the ranch. He had noticed the change in the town's atmosphere and wanted to offer support. Caleb, he said, leaning on the fence. I see how hard you're working, but people are upset. You need to find a way to show them you respect their feelings. Otherwise, this tension is going to last longer than the land deal itself. Caleb nodded, understanding Martin's concern.
I know.
I didn't mean to upset anyone. I just thought I was doing the right thing for my ranch.
I know you did, Martin said gently. But sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough if people feel hurt. You have to consider how your actions affect everyone around you. This conversation stuck with Caleb. He realized that he couldn't simply rely on his own sense of fairness. He needed to actively work to rebuild relationships and show the community that his intentions were honorable. It was a lesson in humility, one that was difficult for a man used to acting decisively. The growing tension came to a head one afternoon during a community meeting intended to discuss grazing rights. The room was crowded, filled with ranchers and neighbors who wanted to have their voices heard. As the discussion turned to the disputed land, emotions rose quickly. People spoke over one another, sharing stories of past conflicts, lost trust, and fears of being taken advantage of. Caleb sat quietly, trying to listen, but he could feel the weight of their disapproval. Some accused him of stepping into a situation that wasn't his business. Others suggested that he had pressured the families in subtle ways. Though no one raised a hand in anger, the emotional intensity was enough to make the room feel heavy and tense. Caleb realized that he had become a symbol of the very thing the community feared. Someone prioritizing personal gain over relationships and trust.
After the meeting, Caleb walked back to his ranch in silence.
The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. He thought about how quickly a decision meant to secure his future had become a source of conflict. He had not anticipated the emotional weight that came with the land. And now he was confronted with the reality that trust, once shaken, was difficult to repair. At the ranch, he tried to focus on work to distract himself from the tension. He repaired a fence that had been damaged in a recent storm and checked on the cattle. The familiar tasks provided a sense of comfort, but they also reminded him of how much had changed. Where once his neighbors would have stopped by to lend a hand, now he worked alone. The solitude emphasized the gap that had formed between him and the community. Despite the challenges, Caleb remained committed to handling the situation responsibly. He began keeping careful notes on conversations and events related to the land. He documented the wishes and concerns of the families involved, hoping to find a path that would be fair to everyone. He also reflected on his own actions, considering whether there were ways he could have approached the situation differently.
One afternoon, he decided to visit one of the families directly, not to negotiate land, but to listen. The meeting was quiet at first, with both sides speaking carefully.
Caleb explained that he understood their concerns and that his intention was never to cause harm. He emphasized that he wanted to find a solution that respected their feelings and the community's values. The family listened, and while they remained cautious, there was a noticeable softening in their tone. Caleb left with a sense that small steps could make a difference. Rebuilding trust would take time, but he understood that patience and consistent effort were essential. As weeks passed, Caleb continued these efforts. He spoke with neighbors individually, attended community events without pushing the land issue, and offered help where it was needed. Each gesture, though small, was a step toward rebuilding relationships. He began to see subtle changes. Neighbors who had been distant smiled and nodded when they saw him, and some even stopped to ask about his cattle or offer advice. Despite these positive signs, the emotional fallout from the land dispute was still present. People remembered the tension, and some remained cautious in their interactions.
Caleb understood that trust, once shaken, could not be restored overnight. He accepted that rebuilding relationships required not just words, but consistent actions over time. During this period, Caleb also reflected on his own growth.
The experience had taught him humility, patience, and the importance of considering others' perspectives. He realized that success was not only measured by achievements or acquisitions, but also by the quality of relationships and the trust of those around him. One evening, while walking through his fields, Caleb thought about the balance between ambition and responsibility. He recognized that while expanding his ranch was important, it was equally important to maintain the respect and support of the community. The land deal had become a test of character, requiring him to navigate complex emotions and social dynamics with care. He also noticed changes within himself. He had become more attentive, more thoughtful in his interactions, and more aware of how his actions affected others. He understood that even well-intentioned decisions could have unintended consequences, and that listening and empathy were essential tools in managing relationships. Caleb continued to manage his ranch with the same dedication as before, but now he approached his work with a deeper understanding of the social and emotional context in which he operated. He realized that a rancher's life was not only about land and animals, but also about community, trust, and mutual support. As the weeks turned into months, Caleb's efforts to rebuild trust began to show results. Neighbors started to engage with him more openly, offering assistance and advice. The families involved in the land dispute began to communicate more calmly, and the tension in the community slowly eased. Caleb understood that the resolution would not be perfect, but progress had been made. Through this experience, Caleb learned an important lesson. Decisions, no matter how practical, must consider the human impact. The land deal had challenged him not only as a rancher, but as a member of a community. By acknowledging the concerns of others, listening carefully, and acting with integrity, he was able to navigate a difficult situation while maintaining his principles. By the end of this period, Caleb felt a sense of cautious optimism. He knew that rebuilding trust would continue to require effort, patience, and understanding, but he was committed to the process. He had grown not only as a rancher but also as a person, gaining a deeper appreciation for the complexity of relationships, the value of empathy, and the importance of balancing ambition with responsibility.
The experience had left its mark on him.
He no longer saw land purely as a business opportunity. He saw it as part of a larger network of relationships, history, and shared experiences. Caleb understood that true success came from achieving goals without damaging the bonds that connect people. And as he watched the sun set over his ranch, casting golden light across the fields, Caleb felt a quiet determination. The challenges were not over, but he had learned how to face them with patience, respect, and careful thought. He was ready to continue working, not only to secure his ranch's future, but also to strengthen the trust and connection within the community that he had learned to value more than ever. After months of tension, quiet observation, and careful effort, Caleb Turner finally began to see the first signs of real change in his community. The days of whispers behind his back and the subtle glances of disapproval were slowly giving way to cautious acceptance. Though nothing returned immediately to the way it had been, Caleb noticed that neighbors started engaging in small, meaningful ways. A simple wave across the street, a nod at the feed store, a question about the cattle.
All these gestures signaled that the community was beginning to reopen its doors to him. Caleb knew that patience had been his greatest tool.
He reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The initial excitement about acquiring new land, the warnings from Walter Hayes, the growing unease as the families expressed concern, and the realization that trust mattered more than property. Each step had taught him something valuable about people, relationships, and the responsibility that came with ambition. One morning, he received a visit from one of the families directly involved in the land dispute. The father, a man named Henry, had always been proud and protective of his property. For weeks, Caleb had feared this conversation, unsure of whether it would be tense or even hostile. Instead, Henry arrived with a calm demeanor and a willingness to talk. "I appreciate you taking the time to listen," Henry said. "I can see that you weren't trying to hurt anyone. You wanted what was right for your ranch, but you also listened to our concerns, and that makes a difference." Caleb felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, Henry."
"I want to make sure that whatever happens, it's fair and respectful to everyone. Your family has a long history here, and I don't want to damage that."
The conversation went on for hours, not just about land, but about life, farming, and shared experiences.
Caleb realized that understanding each other's perspectives had done more to mend relationships than any legal agreement ever could.
By the time Henry left, Caleb felt that a bridge had been built. Fragile, but real. Word of the meeting spread quietly. People in town began to see Caleb not as someone taking advantage, but as a man willing to admit mistakes, listen, and act respectfully. Slowly, other neighbors who had been distant started returning to their usual interactions. Invitations to community events returned, and casual conversations resumed at the feed store. Caleb noticed that some neighbors even offered to help with small tasks around his ranch, gestures he had not expected a few months ago. Caleb's daily routine remained busy, but it was no longer tinged with the weight of tension. Feeding cattle, repairing fences, and managing the land were as important as ever, but now these tasks were accompanied by a sense of satisfaction. P had learned that success wasn't only measured in acres or cattle numbers, but in relationships and trust.
The respect of the community, he realized, was more valuable than any property he could acquire.
He continued to approach the disputed land cautiously. Rather than rushing toward ownership, he engaged in conversations with both families, exploring solutions that could benefit everyone. Some ideas involved joint grazing agreements, others involved structured leasing arrangements. Caleb understood that compromise was not weakness, but a way to ensure long-term stability and harmony. One afternoon, he sat with Martin and discussed the progress. "I feel like we're finally moving in the right direction," Caleb said, watching the cattle graze across the fields.
"It took longer than I expected, but people are starting to understand that my intentions were honest. It's never easy to fix things once tension starts, but you stayed patient and respectful, and that's what matters."
People notice effort and integrity, even if it takes time. Parallel realized that the journey had also changed him personally. He had always been practical and decisive, but now he had learned the importance of empathy, active listening, and understanding emotions. These lessons extended beyond land and ranching. They applied to every interaction in his life. He felt more connected to his community, not because he had gained anything material, but because he had learned to value the people around him. As the weeks passed, the families involved in the land dispute reached an agreement that satisfied everyone. It wasn't exactly what Caleb had first imagined, but it was fair, sustainable, and respectful of history. One family decided to sell a portion of the land, while another agreed to share grazing rights through a clear agreement. Psst! Caleb felt no bitterness about compromise. He understood that relationships and trust were worth more than a few extra acres. The community slowly returned to normal. Neighbors who had been wary now greeted him warmly, and the subtle distance that had marked interactions for months gradually disappeared. Caleb noticed that even small acts of cooperation, helping with repairs, sharing tools, or exchanging advice, had returned. The town felt alive again, and Caleb felt a sense of belonging he had feared losing. Caleb's ranch thrived, not just because of the additional land, but because of the renewed sense of connection with the community.
Work became more efficient, not because of legal arrangements, but because people were willing to cooperate and support one another.
Rasp.
Caleb understood that the strength of a ranch wasn't measured solely by land or cattle, but by the network of relationships that made life smoother and more meaningful. One evening, Caleb visited the disputed land.
The sun was setting, casting golden light across the fields, and he felt a deep sense of peace. The stream that ran along the edge sparkled in the light, and the grass swayed gently in the breeze. Bah! He reflected on how much had changed in the past months, the excitement and tension, the frustration and worry, and finally the sense of resolution and harmony. He thought about Walter Hayes and Martin, about the families and neighbors, and realized that the most important lessons had been about people, not land. Patience, honesty, empathy, and communication had made all the difference. He understood that the strongest foundations weren't built only on property or money, but on trust and respect. Caleb also reflected on his own growth. He had faced challenges that tested his patience, humility, and decision-making. He had learned to consider the consequences of his actions, to listen carefully, and to take responsibility for the impact he had on others. These lessons would guide him in every future endeavor, not just in ranching, but in life. The experience strengthened his bonds with the community. He now felt a genuine sense of belonging and mutual respect. Children played near the fences, neighbors offered advice and assistance, and the town felt vibrant once again. Caleb realized that the future of his ranch was tied closely to the health of these relationships, and he felt committed to nurturing them for years to come. In the final months of the story, Caleb also focused on teaching younger ranchers and family members about the lessons he had learned. He spoke about patience, responsibility, and the importance of community. He shared the story of the disputed land as an example of how ambition must be balanced with empathy, and how trust, once lost, takes time and effort to rebuild. Through this experience, Caleb became more than a successful rancher. He became a respected member of his community in a new way. People admired not just his skill with cattle and land, but his integrity, humility, and willingness to listen. His reputation grew stronger because of the way he handled challenges, not in spite of them. By the end of the year, the ranch was thriving, relationships were healed, and the town felt connected once more. Caleb had achieved what he set out to do, but in a way he could not have anticipated. He had gained not just land, but wisdom, community respect, and a deeper understanding of human nature. The final lesson Caleb carried forward was simple yet profound. Success is measured not only by what you gain, but by how you treat others along the way. The land would provide for his ranch, but trust and respect would sustain his life. And as he watched the sun set over his fields one quiet evening, he felt gratitude for the journey, the challenges, the mistakes, the lessons, and the resolution. He understood that true accomplishment came from balancing ambition with care for the people around him. From that point on, Caleb approached every decision with thoughtfulness and patience. He continued to expand his ranch carefully, always considering the impact on neighbors, families, and the community. The town remained supportive, relationships remained strong, and Caleb's life became richer, not only in land and resources, but in trust, friendship, and shared history. In the end, the dispute that had once caused tension became a story of growth, understanding, and reconciliation. Best. Caleb's experience showed that even difficult challenges can lead to meaningful lessons, stronger communities, and personal growth when handled with respect, patience, and integrity. The ranch flourished, the community thrived, and Caleb Turner's name became associated not just with land and cattle, but with fairness, humility, and the ability to turn conflict into lasting connection.